Ancient texts reveal that the gods did not always win. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, from a bed, a couch, a dim corner of a room where the air has finally cooled, we can let that claim sit gently in the dark without forcing it to become a spectacle. We will handle it the way an archivist handles a fragile object, slowly, with clean hands, with the awareness that the most important details are often small enough to miss. We begin in a storage vault that is not designed to impress anyone. No grand columns, no bright banners, just climate control, metal shelving, and the soft, constant breath of conditioned air. A drawer slides out with the low scrape of oiled rails. Inside is a shallow tray lined with foam. In the center rests a clay tablet, small enough to fit in both our palms, the color of baked sand with a faint gray cast where the surface has been rubbed by time. The edges are chipped, not dramatically, but in the ordinary way objects chip when they have been handled, stacked, carried, and moved across centuries. Hairline cracks thread along one corner like dried riverbeds. The tablet feels cool even in a warm room, as if it keeps a memory of deeper stone. A paper tag is tucked beneath the foam lip. It reads like a coordinate, an internal promise that this object can be found again. Inventory label, shelf position, collection code, a tablet ID with a pattern of letters and numbers that suggests a larger system. A second note, written later, adds a short phrase in careful handwriting. Unusual closing formula. Not forgery, not damaged, just unusual. That is how real anomalies often enter the record. Quietly, without drama, under a raking light. The wedge marks sharpen. The tablet is administrative in appearance. Not a hymn, not an epic. It has the neat, compressed density of accounting, the kind of text created by trained hands that had to meet a daily standard. There are lines arranged in a workmanlike grid, each line beginning with a familiar structure, then a name, then a quantity, then a destination or purpose. The wedges themselves carry rhythm, as if the scribe's stylus kept a steady pace. We can almost hear the faint tap and drag, the sound of an office, rather than a temple. At first glance, it seems routine. A list, a tally, a movement of goods or offerings. But the notes in the margin of the modern tag tell us to slow down near the bottom. The anomaly lives in the closing. Most administrative tablets end the same way. They close like a door that locks properly. Date, authority, seal, a phrase that says, in effect, this is done, this has been witnessed, this has been verified. The closure is a ritual of continuity. It is designed to prevent dispute. It is designed to hold the world in place. This one closes differently. The final line uses a procedural phrase that belongs to a different category of tablets, a category that implies disruption. It is not the language of completion. It is the language of departure. It reads like a transfer statement, but not a normal transfer, not a sale, not a gift, not an offering to a god in residence. The phrasing suggests removal under constraint, a controlled withdrawal. It is the kind of line a scribe might write when the office is trying to remain an office, while the building around it becomes something else. We do not need to sensationalize it. We do not need to pretend the clay shouts. The wedge marks do not scream. They imply, they register procedure. The oddness is that the scribe did not switch to a different genre to describe the situation. The scribe stayed inside the language of administration, as if the crisis had to be recorded in the same calm register as barley and wool. A rare word appears in the closing, a term that is usually reserved for sealing up goods for transport, rather than placing them into a local storehouse. Alongside it is a determinative marker that nudges a name into a category that feels elevated, not quite human, not quite the ordinary title of an official. In Sumerian writing, those small markers can matter. They are like the labels on file folders. They tell the reader what kind of thing follows. Here, the marker suggests a figure or office that the scribe wants us to recognize as extraordinary. Yet, the quantities listed above remain practical. The tablet does not list miracles. It lists items that could be carried: containers, metals, textiles, tools, perhaps a set of cult objects that would normally stay in a sanctuary. The list feels like someone deciding what can be saved. When we look at the tablet as a first witness, the mood changes. It is not trying to persuade us of a myth. It is trying to keep track, and that is where the strange power lies. Myths teach, lists testify. The most common story that later generations tell is tidy. The gods, the great assembly, the high authority in the sky. They establish order. They defeat chaos. They allocate powers. They build cities. They appoint kings. Their conflicts are dramatic, but ultimately stabilizing. Even when a god is humbled, the system survives. That is the comfortable narrative, polished by repetition. But that requires ignoring three stubborn features of what this tablet suggests. First, the closure implies removal rather than distribution. It reads less like a temple receiving and more like a temple sending away, under pressure, with an emphasis on securing and sealing. Second, the chain of authority looks compressed. Instead of a wide set of witnesses, the text points to a narrow authorization, as if normal oversight was not available, or not safe. In bureaucracy, narrowed oversight often means urgency. Third, the category marker attached to the receiving office, or the supervising figure, hints at a tier that the scribe wanted to keep distinct. It is not a casual flourish. It is a filing choice. And filing choices often reflect an internal hierarchy. None of this proves a war. None of this proves gods with weapons. We will keep our language careful. The clay does not give us battle scenes. It gives us a procedure that does not belong. What if the old stories of divine conflict were not only mythic theatre, but also a way of narrating real institutional shocks? What if the gods, in certain contexts, functions as the top layer of authority? A set of offices, cult centers, and sanctioned commands that could be disrupted, displaced, or defeated. If we read the closing formula as a crisis protocol, the tablet becomes a record of managed retreat, not panic, not collapse, but withdrawal, a loss handled with administrative discipline. That is a soft hypothesis. We can hold it like the tablet itself, aware that a small object can be misread if we grip it too hard. To investigate, we will move with method and restraint. We will examine how administrative language changes when a city is threatened or when a temple network is reorganized. We will analyze catalogued lists, sealings, and transfer notes for patterns of storage, movement, and unusual authorization. We will read king lists as continuity documents, looking for seams where legitimacy is carefully stitched. We will approach epics and laments not for spectacle, but for procedural memory. The way a culture remembers disruption without naming it outright. We will look at temple layers and rebuilding phases to see whether architecture echoes the same logic as the tablets. We will also pay attention to small technical choices, determinatives, rare verbs, and the placement of names, because crisis often hides in grammar. For now, we stay with the object in the tray. Along the left edge, a shallow indentation suggests it was once pressed with a seal. The seal itself is not preserved on the surface, but the clay remembers the pressure. A scribe who expects the future expects seals. Seals say, this movement was authorized. Seals say, do not argue with this list later. If there was a withdrawal, it was intended to be legitimate. That detail matters. Defeat can be messy. Managed defeat is different. It tries to preserve the idea of lawful order, even as order is being relocated. The tablet's surface has a slight sheen where fingers once traced the lines. Someone checked it. Someone confirmed the quantities. Someone made sure the final phrase was written correctly. That is another quiet clue. The anomaly is not a scribal accident. It is deliberate. The inventory label beneath the foam keeps the tablet pinned to a modern grid, but the tablet itself points to an older grid, a world in which the most powerful entities were recorded through logistics. If the highest authority needed to leave, the departure would be recorded the same way any valuable inventory is recorded, with calm wedges pressed into clay, with a closing formula that locks the door on a room that may not be entered again. The investigation pauses here, with the tablet cooling in our imagination like stone in moonlight. The wedges do not declare the name of an enemy. They do not announce a victory parade. They leave us with one procedural question that is almost too quiet to notice. If this was a withdrawal, who wrote the protocol that made it look routine? In a different archive, under different fluorescent lights, a different drawer opens to the same cold air. The object we find there is not shaped like a tablet, meant for a single list. It is longer, slightly bowed, like clay that dried while resting on a reed mat. The surface is darker, fired more thoroughly, and the wedges are deeper, cut with a stylus that pressed hard enough to leave sharp edges. A catalogue slip notes a handful of repaired breaks. The joins are clean, but the lines of repair run like pale scars, reminding us that the document survived in pieces. The text is not identical to the first witness. That is important. It would be easy, and dishonest, to make every clue echo the same phrase. Real patterns are messier. They repeat with variation. They keep the underlying shape while changing the skin. This second record appears to be a receipt or transfer note, the kind of item that would follow a shipment. It lists names that look like officials. Scribes, supervisors, it lists containers, it lists quantities. It lists a destination that is not a city name, but a functional place. A kind of storage category, a protected room within a compound. In administrative language, that kind of destination is a signal. It says the goods are not just being moved. They are being placed under controlled custody. Near the center of the text, a verb appears that is common enough in ordinary contexts, but here it is paired with an unusual object. The verb is the kind that means to take, to remove, to carry off. In routine accounts, it might refer to grain taken from storage for rations. Here, it governs a set of items that are normally anchored, items that have a ceremonial gravity. The list includes things that sound like temple implements and cult furnishings, the kinds of objects that define a sanctuary as a sanctuary. When those objects travel, the city's identity travels with them. A scribe would not casually record such movement without marking it as authorized. And this record does mark it. The authorization is not in a flourish, not in a mythic justification, but in an administrative compression that feels like a hand tightening around a file. The witness list is short. The titles are formal. A seal impression appears at the edge, clearer than the repaired lines, with a faint curvature that suggests a cylinder seal rolled quickly, perhaps more quickly than usual. Fast seals can happen when the office is busy. Fast seals can also happen when the office is frightened. We do not need to guess emotion. We can focus on procedure. The procedure says, valuable items were removed from their normal context and placed into controlled storage or transport. The procedure says, fewer people were asked to witness than would normally be expected for such high-status inventory. The procedure says, the record is meant to stand up later as proof. That is one tablet. But an investigative rhythm emerges when we open more drawers. In another collection, a fragmentary tablet preserves only the end of an account. The broken lines leave gaps where quantities once sat. Yet, the closing survives, and the closing is where crisis tends to hide. The closure includes a phrase indicating that the items have been sealed, not merely counted. Sealing implies a boundary, a decision to prevent access. In calm times, sealing happens for integrity. In strained times, sealing happens for control. In a different fragment, the text is a short label, the kind that might have been attached to a basket or jar. It names contents, and then it includes a destination marker that is not a household or workshop, but a term that can be read as a protected deposit. The label is small, but labels are the nerves of a system. They carry instructions without narrative. As the documents accumulate, a pattern takes shape in the way patterns truly form, not through repetition of the same sentence, but through repetition of the same operational logic. The logic is this: valuables are inventoried, then sealed, then transferred, then placed under restricted custody, and the language used to describe this sequence becomes more prominent than the language of offering, distribution, or celebration. When a bureaucracy leans hard on sealing and custody terms, it is often responding to instability. It is bracing itself. One of the most telling shifts is the way destinations are written. In ordinary temple records, destinations can be lively: a kitchen, a brewery, a weaving room, a work gang, a festival allocation. These are the organs of a functioning city. In the crisis-flavored records, destinations become abstract: storehouse, deposit, treasury, hidden room, a place defined not by production, but by protection. Another shift is the way time is handled. Some tablets include precise dates, as if the record must be anchored in a sequence that can later be reconstructed. Others become oddly vague, using a regnal marker without specifying the month. That vagueness can be damage or loss, but it can also be a tactic, a way to keep the record usable without making it too revealing. We are careful here. We do not claim a secret conspiracy. Bureaucrats do not need conspiracies to write cautiously. They only need risk. Now we come to the term that keeps appearing in small variations, the one that made the catalogers write notes in the margins. The term is not always the same word. Sometimes it is a verb, sometimes it is a noun, sometimes it is a compound phrase. But it points to the same idea: withdrawal under management. In one record, the movement is framed as a transfer into the custody of a named office. In another, the movement is framed as placed into sealed storage under the authority of a particular official. In a third, the record uses a phrase that suggests set aside in a way that feels less like savings and more like emergency segregation. Each time, the text does not explain why. It does not say, because enemies are near. It does not say, because the god is leaving. It does not say, because the city will fall. It simply moves inventory like a person packing quietly while still talking in a calm voice. If we listen to these tablets as a choir of clerks, the silence around motive becomes meaningful. The procedure itself is the message. The system is saying, we are still in control of process, even if we are not in control of events. This is where the idea of conflict enters, not as swords and screams, but as the pressure that forces institutions to relocate their core objects. The pressure that makes witness lists shrink, the pressure that makes seals roll faster, the pressure that makes the language of protection rise, and the language of celebration fall. A war, if there was one, would not necessarily appear as a battle description in administrative archives. Archives do not like drama. Archives like chain of custody. The word Anunnaki belongs to another register, the register of divine assembly and high authority. The way it appears in lists and colophons is often subtle, as a determinative marker, as a class of beings, as a grouping associated with authority, judgment, allocation. In an investigative reading, we can treat that word as a label for the top layer of sanctioned order. If that top layer is strained, the strain might show up exactly here, where the system counts what it can save. We can now articulate the contradiction that begins to trouble the comfortable mythic story. If divine order is stable, why do we see administrative signs that suggest the removal of central cult objects from their home contexts? If the gods are always present, why do records emphasize sealing, custody, and deposit in a way that resembles evacuation logistics? If authority is unbroken, why do some tablets narrow the chain of witnessing as if normal oversight could not be gathered? We remain cautious. There are many reasons objects move. Festivals, renovations, loans, ritual processions. Yet the pattern we are seeing has a different texture. It is less like planned celebration and more like controlled absence. It is less like a parade and more like a packing list. So we adopt a method. We will distinguish between movement that returns and movement that does not. We will look for records where the language of return is missing, We will look for sequences where removal is followed by rebuilding layers in the archaeological record. We will look for later documents that refer to restored cult objects, because restoration implies a prior loss or displacement. We will look for changes in personnel titles, because crisis often reshuffles authority. The investigation pauses, with our hands hovering over the foam tray of another fragment, small and sharp, carrying a single line that still reads cleanly. It lists an object, then a seal, then a destination that is not a room of use, but a place of hiding. In a system designed to make the gods present through objects, hiding the objects is a form of admission. It suggests that something, somewhere, was strong enough to make the highest inventory travel. The public story begins with order. It begins with a clean image. The gods convene. The world is measured. Roles are assigned. And the great cities receive their sanctioned powers as if handed down on a tablet of light. The narrative is smooth enough to be memorized. Even divine conflict, in the popular retelling, tends to resolve into stability. A rebellion is crushed. A monster is slain. A judgment is rendered. The cosmos returns to its proper shape. That story is not false in the way a simple lie is false. It is a mythic surface designed to soothe and instruct. It teaches that authority is legitimate. It teaches that chaos can be contained. It teaches that the assembly will hold. But administrative records do not exist to teach. They exist to manage. And when we place mythic stability beside procedural evidence, the fit becomes uncomfortable. We enter a reading room where the air is dry enough to protect paper and clay alike. On a desk is a set of transliterations, careful columns of signs rendered into modern script, each line tied to a photograph or hand copy. This is where the work becomes quieter, less tactile, but more precise. We are no longer listening for the drama of a story. We are listening for the mechanical tone of a system under strain. One contradiction appears in the vocabulary of authority. In myth, authority is expansive. The gods proclaim. The assembly decrees. Names are spoken broadly, as if the whole divine world is present and in consensus, in a stable system. Consensus is easy to perform. In a cluster of administrative texts, the opposite appears. Authority is narrowed. Instead of broad witnesses, we find single offices. Instead of multiple seals, we find one seal. Instead of open proclamation, we find custody language and restricted destinations. Bureaucracies narrow when they need speed or secrecy. Either way, the narrowing contradicts the mythic picture of open, unified, unquestioned control. A second contradiction appears in the concept of presence. Myth depends on the gods being present, not always in a physical sense, but in a sanctioned sense. Cities exist because a divine power is seated there. A temple is not just a building. It is the residency of a force. Presence is the foundation. Yet, the procedural records we are watching tilt toward absence. The documents that emphasize sealing, deposit, transfer. And protected storage are documents that treat the central objects of presence as mobile and vulnerable. If a city's cult core can be sealed away or moved, then presence can be interrupted. That possibility is rarely allowed to surface plainly in mythic instruction, because it undermines the social contract. A third contradiction appears in the handling of loss. Myth often frames loss as moral. If a city suffers, it is because rules were broken, oaths were neglected, the gods withdrew due to offense. The logic is ethical, almost courtroom-like. The records we are tracing feel logistical rather than moral. They do not say the city sinned. They say containers were sealed, items were transferred, custody was assigned, a controlled deposit was made. This is not a narrative of punishment. It is a narrative of operations. That difference matters. If loss is logistical, then it can be caused by forces that are not moral judges. It can be caused by enemies, by climate, by famine, by internal fracture, by competing authorities. It can be caused by conflict that doesn't fit the moral theatre of myth. And if conflict is not moral, it may not be safe to describe directly. We begin to see why a culture might preserve two layers at once. The public layer says, authority is stable, the gods are in control, chaos is contained. The internal layer, written on clay and filed in baskets, says, protect the core inventory, keep witness lists tight, move what must be moved, seal what must be sealed. This is where the phrase, war we're not supposed to know about, can be reframed in an investigative way. It does not have to mean a hidden battle in the sky. It can mean that the system's disruptions were recorded as procedure, not as story, precisely because story is public and procedure is internal. The suppression, if it exists, is not necessarily a secret police. It is the ordinary division between public narrative and institutional paperwork. Now we turn to a different kind of evidence, still grounded in text, but not in pure accounting. We examine continuity language, the formulas that appear when a system needs to declare that it is still the same system. Continuity language is often invisible until it becomes stress. In stable periods, a scribe can write received and everyone knows what that means. In stressed periods, scribes start to specify. They start to add phrases that anchor legitimacy. They add according to the established procedure. They add under the authority of. They add sealed and witnessed. They add lines that sound like someone repeating a rule aloud to make it real. A small group of tablets in the corpus of administrative writing does exactly this. They lean harder into procedural reassurance. It is a bureaucratic equivalent of a calm voice saying everything is fine while packing a bag. At the same time, the lists begin to show a subtle reorientation in what is valued. In ordinary temple distribution texts, we often see rations, beer, bread, wool, the daily life of the temple economy. In the crisis-flavored movement texts, the items tilt toward durable valuables and cult objects, metals, stones, carefully described implements, items whose loss would be symbolic as well as material. That shift suggests triage, and triage implies threat. We can now state a careful working idea without forcing it into certainty. What if the Anunnaki, in certain administrative contexts, represents the sanctioned assembly that anchors legitimacy? And what if the texts that emphasize sealing and control transfer reflect moments when that legitimacy had to be physically protected because it was contested? Contested by whom is still unknown. The documents do not name a foe. That silence is itself a kind of information. When a system refuses to name an adversary, it may be because naming would grant them legitimacy, or because naming would expose internal fracture, or because naming would create panic. So we shift our attention to the structure of lists. Lists do not only count objects, they map relationships. They reveal what the system thinks is connected. In several texts, the receiving parties are not ordinary workshops or households, but institutional nodes that look like emergency anchors, treasuries, deposits, guarded rooms, or offices associated with sealing authority. This tells us that the system did not simply lose things. It tried to preserve them inside a controlled network. A war, if it exists in this picture, is not a clash of armies described in song. It is a contest over control of nodes, over who holds seals, over who can authorize transfers, over who can claim custody of the core objects that make a city legitimate. That kind of war is exactly the kind an archive can register without ever saying the word war. We close our eyes for a moment and imagine a temple not as a place of incense alone, but as an administrative engine, rooms of storage, tables of scribes, baskets of tablets drying in the sun, seals hanging from cords. When pressure comes, the engine does not suddenly become poetic. It becomes stricter. It becomes quieter. It turns towards sealing and custody. The pattern remains. It does not shout. It insists. The investigation pauses with a final tension that we can feel even in the quiet. A myth can claim the gods won. A tablet can show the gods being packed. There is a way defeat hides in plain sight. It hides in forms that are designed to prevent argument. It hides in the language of custody, in the grammar of authority, in the small choices a scribe makes when the old arrangement of power can no longer be assumed. If the highest level of order suffers a setback, the system does not always announce it. The system tries to keep functioning. It files the event as a procedure. So we adopt a soft hypothesis, one that does not demand certainty. What if some texts that later readers treat as divine administration are, in their original environment, crisis administration? What if the Anunnaki, rather than being only a dramatic cast of supernatural figures, also serves as a label for a governing tier, an assembly level that can be pressured, displaced, or forced into managed withdrawal? If we read the evidence that way, we do not claim that gods bled on a battlefield. We claim something quieter and more plausible in the archive. That the structure called divine experienced operational defeat. And the defeat was handled through protocols meant to preserve continuity. To test this, we look for the fingerprints of a managed retreat. Managed retreats do not look like chaos. They look like planning under constraint. They produce certain kinds of paperwork, transfer notes, sealed inventories, restricted deposits, statements of authority, and, crucially, language that anticipates reconstitution later. In the tablet corpora, one feature becomes more interesting once we name it: the presence of continuity clauses. A continuity clause is a small line that says an action is consistent with established practice, even when the action is not normal. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, this is still lawful. In some records, we find phrases that emphasize the regularity of the transfer, even though the transfer itself is exceptional. In others, we find careful specification of who received the items, not because the receiver needs credit, but because the receiver needs to be pinned to responsibility. Responsibility is what a system distributes when it cannot distribute safety. Another fingerprint is the choreography of sealing. In routine storage, sealing can be minimal. A container is closed, a mark is made. The point is to prevent tampering. In crisis storage, sealing becomes ceremonial, multiple seals, particular seal owners, repeated phrases about closure. Sometimes a container is sealed, and then the tablet itself is sealed into a packet. A double enclosure that indicates anxiety about the integrity of the record. We find hints of this anxiety in the way some tablets refer to sealed bundles rather than loose items. Bundles are a crisis technology. Bundles mean you have grouped things to move them quickly. Bundles mean you have decided that access can wait. A third fingerprint is the odd mixture of precision and vagueness. In managed retreats, certain details become hyper-precise because they will matter later. Quantities, seal owners, custody chain. At the same time, other details become vague because they are risky. Routes, reasons, names of threats. The result is a record that feels both obsessively clear and strategically silent. This mixture appears in the corpus. Some tablets count down to the last unit of metal. Some tablets name the seal owner with unusual care. Yet the motive for movement remains absent. The threat remains unnamed. It is as if the records are designed to survive a later audit, without betraying the situation to a casual reader. That is what managed defeat looks like in writing. Now we widen the lens to a category of texts that sit between myth and administration. Foundation inscriptions and ritual instructions. These texts often serve to anchor legitimacy. They tell us who built what, who dedicated what, who restored what. They do not exist in the same daily rhythm as rationalists, but they share the same obsession with continuity. They exist to prove that the system is still intact. In periods of stability, foundation inscriptions can be celebratory. In periods of strain, they become defensive. They emphasize restoration. They emphasize return. They emphasize that the proper order has been re-established. Restoration is a word that implies loss. When a ruler says he restored a temple, it is not always simple maintenance. It can mean a recovery from disruption. When a text says a god's cult was returned to its seat, it implies that the cult had been displaced. When a ritual instruction includes emergency alternatives, it implies that the normal ritual context could not be guaranteed. We treat these not as dramatic evidence, but as structural evidence. Systems that never suffer defeat do not need so much restoration language. Systems that never lose authority do not need to perform legitimacy so often. Now we introduce a careful, interpretive move. In many traditions, the divine assembly is both theological and political. It is a model of governance. It is an explanation of why authority is legitimate, if that model is threatened by real political upheaval. The texts might preserve the assembly as a mythic constant, while the administrative records reveal the stress in the actual institutions that claim to embody it. This would mean that the gods in the public story can remain victorious even while the offices that represent them are forced to retreat. A lost war, in this frame, is a lost contest for control of the administrative and cultic network. We can see how this might happen without any supernatural battle. Imagine competing city-states, shifting alliances, invasion, internal conflict, drought, famine, and the collapse of trade routes. In such a landscape, temples and palaces scramble to protect their valuables and their legitimacy. They move cult objects. They seal treasuries. They narrow witnesses. They assign custody. Later, the public story can interpret the same sequence as divine judgment, divine anger, divine departure. But the internal paperwork knows it as operations. This is not a cynical reading. It is an archival reading. Now we look for one more fingerprint: the appearance of emergency officers. In some records, the titles of officials shift. We begin to see supervisors associated with sealing, with guarded storage, with special deposits. These titles might exist in calm times too, but their increased visibility suggests a system leaning on its security apparatus. When security titles rise in frequency, it implies risk. We also notice in some texts the emphasis on handing over and receiving, in a form that resembles legal transfer rather than ordinary distribution. The verbs become legalistic. The structure becomes almost courtroom-like. That legal tone is a hallmark of a system anticipating dispute, anticipating that someone later will ask, who had this? Who authorized it? Where did it go? Dispute is the shadow of defeat. A victorious system can be casual. A strained system becomes exact. Now, the Anunnaki label becomes more provocative, but we keep it careful. The term, in certain contexts, can be read as a collective of high-status divine entities, often linked with authority and judgment. If an administrative record applies elevated markers to a receiving office or to a set of items associated with that collective, it suggests that the movement involved top-tier legitimacy objects. Top-tier objects do not move unless something forces them. Our soft hypothesis, therefore, has a shape. The records suggest a sequence of controlled inventory protection that resembles a managed retreat. The language of sealing, custody, restricted deposit, narrowed witnessing, and continuity clauses implies an institutional response to a threat that is not named. The mythic layer preserves victory and cosmic order, while the administrative layer preserves the mechanics of withdrawal. In that gap between layers, the idea of a lost war can exist as an administrative fact without ever being sung as a public defeat. We do not declare that we have solved a mystery. We do not claim to expose a forbidden truth. We simply note that the paperwork looks like the paperwork of a system protecting itself under pressure. The investigation pauses with a final image that is almost too quiet to be ominous. A seal, not a dramatic seal, not a royal flourish, but a functional impression pressed into clay, the mark of a person responsible for keeping the ledger honest. If the highest order was forced to move, then the last thing it left behind was not a sword. It was a seal that made the retreat legal. We can learn a great deal by listening to nouns. In administrative writing, nouns are not decorative. They are the joints of reality. They tell us what the system thinks exists, what can be moved, what can be counted, what can be protected. When a crisis arrives, the nouns do not change as quickly as the verbs. The nouns stay familiar, but they begin to cluster in new ways. They begin to form new constellations, and those constellations can resemble evacuation even when no one writes the word evacuation. So we set aside the grand labels and focus on a specific category, transfer language that sounds like emergency logistics. We encounter a set of texts where the primary action is not distribution, but relocation. The lists are not oriented toward feeding workers or supplying festivals. They are oriented toward moving durable assets. The nouns that repeat include containers, seals, bundles, weights, and terms for restricted storage. We also see nouns for personnel that are linked to safeguarding rather than production. Gate officials, seal holders, supervisors of deposit rooms, couriers, scribes assigned to custody. Each noun is a small door. We open them one by one. The container terms matter first. In calm times, a container is merely a container. In stress times, containers become units of security. When records specify container type more carefully than usual, it implies that the container is part of the control mechanism. A particular kind of jar might be used because it can be sealed in a certain way. A particular kind of basket might be used because it can be transported quickly. A particular kind of box might be used because it can be locked and stamped. We notice that some records do not list objects directly at all. They list sealed containers, as if the system has chosen to treat a container as the primary item. That is significant. It means the system is prioritizing integrity over accessibility. It is willing to sacrifice easy verification of contents in exchange for speed and control. That is an emergency posture. The seal terms deepen the picture. Seals in Mesopotamian administration are not just signatures. They are portable authority. A seal owner carries the right to validate movement. If a system is evacuating valuable items, control of seals becomes as important as control of objects. Some records emphasize which seal was used and by whom, sometimes repeating the seal owner's name or title as if to close every possible loophole. When a text repeats seal ownership, it is anticipating suspicion. Another cluster of nouns involves place terms that feel defensive. Instead of lively destinations like workshops and kitchens, we find references to rooms defined by restriction, treasury rooms, sealed chambers, deposits, and storehouses, with language that implies guarded access. Sometimes the destination is described not by its function, but by its status. A place that is sealed becomes a place in its own right, like a legal condition turned into a location. That shift is subtle but telling. It suggests that the condition of being sealed has become an organizing principle. When being sealed becomes central, the system is no longer primarily about circulation. It is about containment. Now we examine destination markers that appear unusual because they interrupt the expected geography. In ordinary administrative movement, a destination is often local and specific. A city quarter, a temple room, a named workshop. In the crisis-flavored records, the destination can be written as a category rather than a point, or it can be written with a determinative that suggests an institution outside the usual network. This can indicate a temporary holding site, a relocation node, or a protected facility associated with higher authority. The effect is that the movement feels less like internal redistribution and more like extraction. Extraction is a strong word, so we keep it careful. We can say relocation under constraint. One striking feature is the appearance of abrupt chain of custody language, where a record is structured like a baton pass. The text does not merely state that items exist. It states that items were handed from one responsible person to another, often with a clear boundary between the parties, in some cases. The verbs used are those of formal transfer rather than casual giving. The language reads like legal handover, with the implication that any break in the chain would be a violation. Chain of custody is not a festival concern. It is a risk concern. We also see a quiet emphasis on grouping. Grouping is the technique of evacuation. If you can no longer operate as normal, you decide what goes together. Cult objects might be grouped with their associated implements. Metal might be grouped by purity. Textiles might be grouped by type and function. The grouping tells us what the administrators considered essential to preserve the identity of the institution. Preserving identity is what you do when you fear displacement. Now we turn to a different kind of noun, one that sits uncomfortably in administrative lists, terms that denote elevated beings or divine categories. In many tablets, divine names and categories appear as recipients of offerings or as references to temple institutions. That is normal. What becomes interesting is when such terms appear in contexts that look like protective relocation. If a record indicates that items associated with a high-status divine category were sealed and transferred into restricted custody, it suggests that the system treated that divine category as a vulnerable asset. Vulnerable assets are assets that can be taken. The public story often frames divine departure as voluntary, an act of judgment or will. The administrative posture implies something slightly different. It implies that departure could be managed, negotiated, and controlled because it was not purely metaphysical. It was embodied in objects and procedures. If those objects are at risk, the system responds as if facing a hostile environment. We can now introduce a more specific interpretive possibility, still cautious. If the Anunnaki represent a top-tier authority set, then the movement of associated objects and the tightening of custody language could reflect a moment when that authority set was losing control over the territory that normally sustained it. A lost contest for control would not necessarily destroy the authority. It could displace it. It could force it into mobile form, preserved through sealed bundles and guarded deposits. This is how administrations survive. They do not always hold ground. They hold records. One more noun cluster gives the picture a sharper edge. Terms for temporary status. Some records mark items as set aside, reserved, placed under special condition, or not to be opened, even when the exact phrasing varies. The administrative meaning is consistent. These are items removed from ordinary circulation. They are under a different rule set. That is an emergency inventory category. Emergency categories exist because normal categories fail under pressure. We also see occasional references to personnel assigned to transport or escort. Not military in the modern sense, but officials whose titles suggest movement and supervision across space. When such titles appear alongside sealed bundles and restricted deposits, it suggests that the network is actively moving valuables through a landscape where movement is not safe by default. Safety has to be manufactured by procedure. We can feel the atmosphere of such a moment without dramatizing it. Scribes at desks, couriers waiting, seal owners rolling impressions quickly, containers being counted twice, doors being sealed, rooms being locked, the air thick with the smell of clay and oil. A system doing everything it can to remain itself while shifting its core. The investigation pauses on a small, almost mundane detail that becomes heavy when we think like administrators. In several records, the quantities are rounded in a way that suggests packing, not exact individual counts of small items, but grouped totals that fit container units. That is the mathematics of transport. It is how you count when you are loading. Loading implies departure. And when the core legitimacy objects of a cult network are loaded, the system is behaving as if it expects to be without its home. The tablets do not say who pushed it into that posture. They only show that the posture existed, and that it was formal, documented, and sealed. Eridu is not just a name in a list. It is a mood. It sits at the edge of water and memory, a place where reeds and mud can build a city and then quietly reclaim it. In the imagination, it is ancient even among ancient places. But tonight we approach it not as romance, not as legend, but as an anchor site, where an administrative system might reveal how it behaves when pressure rises. We picture a low mound under a pale sky, layers of mud brick compressed into a single hill. The ground is powdery with salt. The wind carries fine grit that settles into seams and pockets. Excavation trenches cut into the slope like careful wounds, exposing stacked floors and walls, each one a paused moment of occupancy. There are no dramatic statues waiting in the dirt. The evidence is mostly architecture and debris, the quiet kind. We begin with the temple. A temple is a ritual place. Yes, but in a city like Eridu, it is also a warehouse, an office, a registry, and a node in a network. Its rooms are designed for movement of goods as much as movement of prayers. When the system is stable, those rooms produce a certain kind of residue, storage jars in predictable clusters, ceilings in expected places, ash from kitchens, reed impressions from mats, tablets with routine accounts. When a system shifts into preservation mode, the residue changes. One change is the pattern of access. In a stable phase, doors are used and reused. Thresholds wear down. Pathways are clear. In a stressed phase, doorways can be narrowed or blocked. New partitions appear, and certain rooms become less about use and more about protection. This can happen for many reasons, including renovation and changing ritual practice. But the overall effect is the same. The building becomes more compartmentalized. Compartmentalization is a security response. Another change is the distribution of ceilings. Ceilings are the clay lumps used to secure doors, jars, or bundles, often impressed with a seal. In ordinary activity, ceilings are common but not obsessive. In periods where custody and restricted access become central, ceilings can increase in number and variety. They appear at doorways, on storage jar stoppers, on bundle ties. They cluster near places where movement is being controlled. If we imagine Eridu under strain, we imagine ceilings becoming the building's nervous system. A third change is the treatment of temple furniture and cult objects. We cannot always identify cult objects in the ground, because many were made of perishable materials or were removed long ago. Yet we can sometimes see signs of removal. Empty pedestals, spaces where installations once stood, a disruption in the pattern of offering debris, a sudden shift in the kinds of items left behind. When a cult object is removed intentionally, It is often accompanied by unusual cleanliness. The room is not destroyed. It is emptied. Emptying is a deliberate act. Now we bring in the administrative angle that makes Eridu an anchor rather than a symbol. In a temple network, Eridu would have held records. Those records might be moved when threatened, but the movement itself can leave traces. Not all tablets travel. Some break. Some are discarded. Some are sealed into caches. Sometimes we find groups of tablets deposited together, as if someone gathered them quickly and hid them. A cache is not a library. It is a decision. We imagine a scribe in Eridu making that decision, not with theatrical fear, but with practical urgency. Which tablets matter? The ones that prove ownership, the ones that prove obligations, the ones that list valuables, the ones that identify seal owners, the ones that show chain of custody. In a contested environment, records become weapons in a legal sense. They can be used to reclaim property later. They can be used to assert legitimacy. This is where the idea of managed withdrawal becomes grounded in mudbrick. If the higher authority associated with the temple expected disruption, it would not only move cult objects, it would also protect the paperwork that anchors claims. Now we focus on the subtle way a building can shift from public ritual to protected storage without ever abandoning its sacred identity. In stable phases, the temple is porous. People come and go. Offerings move in. Rations move out. Workshops hum. In preservation mode, the temple becomes inward. It reduces circulation. It emphasizes locked rooms. It emphasizes guarded thresholds. It becomes less like a market and more like a vault. A vault is still sacred, but it is sacred with its doors closed. We can also look at rebuilding as a form of testimony. When a temple is rebuilt after disruption, the builders often reuse old bricks, old foundations, old plans. They claim continuity. Yet the new phase can include subtle defensive choices. Thicker walls in certain areas, fewer access points, different storage layouts. These choices can be read as lessons learned from prior vulnerability. Lessons imply prior harm. Eridu, as an ancient temple center, is often invoked in stories about origins. But in a crisis reading, origins are not the only thing that matters. What matters is how an origin city behaves when its role is threatened. If the city is a symbolic anchor, it becomes a target. If it is a node in the network of legitimacy, controlling it becomes a way to control the narrative of who holds rightful authority. This brings us to another quiet piece of evidence: the difference between destruction and abandonment. A city can be destroyed violently, leaving burned layers and broken walls. A city can also be abandoned through managed withdrawal, leaving less fire and more emptiness. In the second case, the most valuable things are removed. The building may still stand. The streets may still exist. But the administrative heart is gone. The city becomes a shell. If we imagine Eridu in such a condition, we imagine rooms swept clean, containers removed, seals taken away, tablets gathered, and the remaining debris being the leftovers of what was not worth moving. That is exactly what we would expect if a high authority tier had to retreat while preserving its core. Now we carefully connect this to the Anunnaki concept without turning it into fantasy. If a divine assembly model is mirrored in temple institutions, then a stress on the institutions is a stress on the model. if the institutions are forced to protect cult objects and records. That protection can be read as the system acknowledging that its highest order can be contested. In myth, the assembly is unshakable. In mudbrick, the assembly needs locks. We do not claim that the Anunnaki marched out of Eridu. We claim that the administrative reality associated with the idea of top-tier divine authority behaved like an institution under threat, and that this behavior can be traced in the way space is partitioned, in the way objects are moved, in the way records are cached, and in the way rebuilding emphasizes secure continuity. The investigation pauses with a final scene in the trench, a floor surface, hard-packed, with a faint line where a wall once stood, a patch of clay near a threshold where ceilings might have fallen and been crushed into dust, a corner where a jar base remains, the jar itself gone. The evidence is quiet, but it forms a coherent gesture. Someone did not simply lose Eridu. Someone managed what could be taken, sealed what could not, and left the rest to the wind. King lists are not stories. They are repairs. They are the kind of document a society creates when it needs to make time behave. A king list takes messy sequences of rule, contested successions, gaps, rival claimants, and it turns them into a single line of legitimacy. It says, this is what happened, in the order we accept. It is not neutral. It is a tool for continuity. That is why its seams matter. We enter a different kind of archive now, one made of copied lines and careful reconstructions, where the king list exists in multiple versions, none fully intact, each preserving a slightly different emphasis. In this environment, the evidence is not only in what the list says, but in how it tries to say it. The list wants to be smooth. When it stumbles, we learn. One seam is the handoff formula. Many king lists use a phrase that functions like a relay. Kingship was in one city, then it was in another. The formula sounds calm, even inevitable. Yet the very need for such a formula implies that kingship can move, and that movement needs justification. If kingship were truly fixed by divine decree, the list wouldn't need to keep explaining its relocations. Explanation is the fingerprint of contested reality. The relocation phrase is often treated as mythic, as if kingship floats like a sacred object. But a list is also an administrative abstraction. It compresses the political history of power transfer into a clean token. In a crisis reading, repeated relocations can indicate repeated disruptions, not ceremonial shifts, but forced ones. It can suggest that the center of authority was repeatedly displaced, and that the displacement was later normalized through formula. Normalizing is what lists do. Another seam is the treatment of duration. King lists assign reign lengths, sometimes enormous, sometimes modest. The numbers can be symbolic, and we do not need to debate their literal accuracy to read their function. The function is to create a sense of controlled time. Yet, at certain points, the list becomes careful in a different way. It might compress several reigns into a brief span. It might present a single ruler with a suspiciously tidy duration. It might smooth over a gap with a formula that feels like filler. Filler is what a document uses when the underlying data is unstable. A third seam is the appearance of unusual qualifiers. A list might call a ruler legitimate by implication, but sometimes It adds descriptors that feel defensive, chosen, confirmed, established, or restored. Those words are not needed when legitimacy is unquestioned. They appear when legitimacy is challenged. In a system that models authority as divinely sanctioned, the need to emphasize sanction suggests pressure on the sanction itself. Pressure is a political form of conflict. Now we introduce a crucial interpretive idea. King lists can function as continuity documents, not only for humans, but for the divine order model. If the divine assembly is the ultimate source of kingship, then a disruption in kingship is also a disruption in the perceived stability of the divine order. A list that repairs kingship is also repairing the image of the god's governance. It says, even if chaos occurred, the authorized line continues. This is where the phrase, lost war, can be understood as a war over continuity. The list does not describe battles. It describes the movement of legitimacy, the relocation of the token called kingship. If kingship had to be moved repeatedly, it implies repeated moments when the previous seat could not hold it. Could not hold it because of what? The list does not say, but its structure suggests the problem it is trying to solve. We can also examine what the list omits. Omissions are not always intentional suppression. They can be ignorance, damage, or the limits of tradition. Yet, in continuity documents, omissions have a direction. They often remove rival lines, shorten periods of fragmentation, and reduce messy overlaps. That is what makes the document useful. It becomes a single spine. But a spine is built out of choices. When the list presents a clean transfer of kingship from one city to another, without detailing the messy process, it is doing what an administration does when it wants to move past a defeat. It doesn't celebrate the loss. It reframes it as a lawful transition. The same emotional logic that makes a retreat look like a transfer note can make a political collapse look like a neat handoff. Now we focus on a specific kind of interruption, the appearance of crisis language around certain city names. Some cities in king lists are treated as glorious seats of long stability. Others appear briefly, like flashpoints, like places where kingship briefly landed and then moved again. When kingship lands briefly, it can mean that the city's claim was fragile, or that the broader environment was volatile. Volatility is the shadow of conflict. A war, in the administrative sense, is not only combat. It is the inability to maintain administrative capacity. It is the collapse of reliable taxation, rationing, storage, and record-keeping. If a city cannot maintain those functions, it cannot sustain kingship in the list's logic. So kingship moves. That movement can be read as the list's polite way of recording institutional defeat. Now we bring in the Anunnaki concept again, carefully, as a layer of interpretation rather than a claim. In mythic texts, high divine categories often function as the court that authorizes kingship and judges cities. If a king list repeatedly relocates kingship, it implicitly shows that the authorized order is being forced to adapt. The divine court may remain rhetorically intact, but the human projection of that court is moving, reassembling, and revalidating itself in new places. That reassembly can feel like the administrative echo of a high-tier withdrawal, not because gods marched with banners, but because the institutions that claimed divine backing had to retreat from failed seats and re-establish legitimacy elsewhere. We also notice something else in king lists: the careful maintenance of sequence, even when sequence is hard to maintain. In some historical contexts, multiple rulers can claim authority at once. There can be parallel dynasties. There can be competing cities. The list tends to collapse parallel time into serial time. It makes it one after the other, never side by side. That choice hides conflict by design. It makes a contested landscape readable. Readable landscapes are how a system reassures itself. If we are looking for a war, the public layer does not want to narrate as defeat. This is one place it can be softened, not erased, but translated. A civil fracture becomes a clean succession. A displaced court becomes a simple relocation. A loss of administrative capacity becomes a lawful transfer. We sit with the king list as an artifact of controlled memory. It is not a lie. It is an instrument. It does what instruments do. And the most sensitive moment in an instrument is the joint where two parts connect. That joint must be strong, because the stress of reality presses there. The investigation pauses with a final observation that stays inside the calm language of the document. Kingship is treated like property. Property can be taken. Property can be relocated. Property can be lost and then recorded as transferred. In a world where the divine order is modeled as a court of allocation, the movement of kingship is the movement of the court's decision in material form. When the list repeats that movement, it is quietly acknowledging that authority was not always able to hold its ground. Laments are not only grief, they are documentation with a softer voice. A lament can sound like prayer, but it often behaves like an administrative report translated into ritual language. It lists what has been lost. It marks who is absent. It names the institutions that have failed. It describes a city's functions shutting down, not in the tone of a ledger, but in the tone of a community trying to keep its identity intact while its routines dissolve. That is why laments matter for an investigation of managed defeat. They preserve what a list cannot admit. We imagine a singer in a temple court, voice steady, breath controlled, reciting lines that have been preserved and repeated. The words do not give us a battle map. They give us symptoms. Gates that are quiet, storehouses that are empty, rituals that are interrupted, officials who no longer take their seats. The language is vivid, but its content is logistical. It is about operational capacity. Operational capacity is what war breaks. In our lament, the city is often described as abandoned by its divine patron. The patron is said to have departed, to have turned away, to have withdrawn protection. In public theology, that departure can be explained as judgment. Yet the lament's details often sound like the consequences of invasion. Internal collapse, famine, or political fracture. The divine departure becomes a way to speak about institutional failure without naming every human cause. This is not deception. It is translation. Now we listen for a particular pattern in laments, the sequence of loss. Laments often begin with a rupture in decision-making. The councils do not meet. The assemblies are disrupted. The authoritative voices are silent. That is the first stage. Then the lament moves to the breakdown of provisioning. Food is not distributed. Work gangs do not organize. Crafts are interrupted. The city's daily metabolism fails. Then the lament turns to sacred absence. The god's seat is empty. The temple is quiet. Ritual implements are not used. The final stage is physical emptiness. Streets are silent. Houses are unoccupied. The city becomes a shell. This sequence is important because it mirrors the logic of managed withdrawal. A managed withdrawal begins with decision-making under constraint. It moves to provisioning choices. It then focuses on securing sacred and legitimacy assets. Finally, it leaves behind an empty shell. Laments record the shell. They do not always record the planning, because planning is not an appropriate public sound, but the sequence implies that planning existed. We also hear in laments a consistent preoccupation with gates. Gates are not only military features, they are administrative choke points. They control movement of people, goods, and information. When a lament says gates are silent, it is describing the collapse of regulated circulation. When gates are silent, taxation fails, trade fails, rations fail, and oversight fails. A silent gate is an administrative death. Laments often linger on this detail because it is the city's heartbeat. Now we bring in another feature. Laments frequently personify institutions. They speak of storehouses as if they weep, of temples as if they mourn, of walls as if they know. This personification can seem purely poetic, but it also keeps the focus on infrastructure. The infrastructure is what mattered. The infrastructure is what failed. When a lament describes a brewery no longer brewing, it is describing the loss of rations and communal ritual. When it describes a workshop no longer working, it is describing the loss of production and maintenance. These are not metaphors only, they are operational facts. If we want to understand a conflict that the system does not want to narrate as defeat, laments give us the emotional permission to describe the consequences without naming the cause. Now we listen for the role of divine assemblies within laments. Sometimes a lament describes a divine council deciding the city's fate. It frames the disaster as a verdict. Yet, the verdict language can also function like a retroactive justification for something that happened in the human sphere. When political coalitions shift, when a city loses allies, when an invasion succeeds, the community needs an explanation that protects the concept of cosmic order. The divine verdict provides that explanation. But in the administrative reading, the verdict can mask a loss of control. If a city's central cult objects were removed for protection, the community might experience that as divine departure. The lament records that departure as a theological event. The underlying mechanism might have been transport and sealing. Now we notice a detail that becomes almost haunting in its restraint. Laments sometimes refer to sacred items being absent without naming the items directly. They might say the rites are interrupted, the songs are silent, the offerings are stopped. That can be read as simple devastation. But it can also align with a deliberate removal of key implements and images. If the cult core was taken away, rites would stop even if the building remained. Silence would fall even without fire. Silence is compatible with managed withdrawal. Another aspect of laments that serves our investigation is their attention to hierarchy. Laments do not only mourn common people, they mourn officials, priests, scribes, and leaders. They describe the absence of those who normally perform oversight. That focus indicates that the disaster is not only physical, It is administrative. A city can survive damage if its officials can still coordinate repair. When officials are absent, the city loses its capacity to recover. Absence of officials can happen through death, flight, capture, or reassignment. A managed retreat could reassign officials to protect assets elsewhere. In that case, the lament's grief is still accurate. The city feels abandoned, but the abandonment could have been strategic. We also pay attention to the lament's repeated emphasis on not knowing. In many laments, speakers express confusion. They ask why. They say the city did not understand. That is more than a rhetorical device. It can reflect the reality that decisions were made by a narrow circle, that information was compartmentalized. In a crisis, not everyone is told the plan. People experience the result as sudden, incomprehensible. Compartmentalization produces grief. Now we can form a careful, interpretive link to the Anunnaki idea without making it literal. If the Anunnaki represent the high authority tier in myth, then laments that describe a divine assembly, deciding withdrawal, can be read as a cultural way of describing a top-tier decision to relocate legitimacy. The assembly scene becomes a mythic rendering of a political and institutional choice. The war, if it exists, is a war of pressures that forced that choice. The lament preserves the shock and sorrow of those left behind. We do not claim that the laments are coded battle reports. We claim they preserve after action memory of institutional collapse and managed absence. Using theological language to keep the cosmos intact in speech, the investigation pauses with an image laments often return to a temple court, not burning, not smashed, but empty. The stones cool at night. The wind moves dust across the threshold. The place that once held sound holds silence. The absence feels deliberate, like a room that has been closed for a reason, not merely abandoned in chaos. In that silence, a question remains, voiced not as accusation, but as administrative curiosity. If the god departed, who carried the seat? Wisdom texts do not shout. They regulate. They teach how to speak, how to obey, how to restrain appetite, how to endure misfortune, how to keep the household and the city stable. Their tone is steady, almost parental, and that steadiness can make them seem distant from crisis. Yet wisdom literature often becomes most intense when a society feels unstable. It becomes a technology for keeping people predictable. Predictability is what an administration needs when control is threatened. We enter this layer by listening for instructions that sound like social compartmentalization. In a stable world, advice can be generosity and open. In a strained world, advice turns toward caution. Do not speak loosely. Do not reveal plans. Do not trust easily. Do not expose your household to unnecessary risk. The vocabulary of wisdom becomes a vocabulary of containment. Containment is the social equivalent of sealing. Some wisdom texts emphasize discretion in the presence of authority. They advise measured speech, careful timing, controlled emotion. On one level, this is good social practice. On another level, it teaches a population how to behave when surveillance, rumor, and political danger are real. A society that has experienced upheaval often develops a cultural preference for restraint. Restraint leaves fewer traces. We also find in wisdom literature an emphasis on obedience to procedure. The advice often aligns with administrative order: respect boundaries, honor contracts, keep accounts honest, do not move property without witness, avoid disputes that can escalate. These themes are not random. They train the mind to accept rule-based life. When rule-based life is threatened, the texts double down on it. If the public myth needs to maintain the image of cosmic order, wisdom texts maintain the practice of civic order. Now we look for crisis-specific themes that are often subtle: preparation, endurance, and adaptive conduct. Some wisdom texts counsel storing resources, managing household inventory, avoiding waste. This can be timeless advice, but in a context of instability, it becomes a survival protocol. A culture that has faced shortages and displacement often encodes its lessons in moral language, because moral language travels farther than a memo. A memo is lost. A proverb survives. We also notice the emphasis on the unreliability of fortune. Wisdom texts often remind the listener that status can change quickly, that power can be temporary, that the mighty can fall. That theme can sound like spiritual humility, but it can also be an echo of lived political volatility. When dynasties rise and collapse, when cities lose and regain authority, the population internalizes the lesson that stability is conditional. Conditional stability is the emotional environment of managed defeat. Now we focus on one of the most revealing features: the cultivation of silence. In many wisdom traditions, silence is praised. Do not speak in anger. Do not speak without knowledge. Do not speak in the wrong place. Silence is framed as virtue. Virtue can be a social technology. In an environment where information can be dangerous, silence is both moral and practical. A society that has experienced contested authority often develops layered speech. Public words are safe. Private words are careful. Certain words are never said at all. Over time, that becomes wisdom. It becomes the right way to live. If there was a conflict that the system did not want publicly narrated as a defeat, wisdom texts are one place where the habit of non-disclosure could be cultivated without ever naming what is being withheld. We also look at how wisdom texts handle trust. Advice often warns against unreliable companions, against sharing plans, against being too open, even with neighbors. This can be read as general cynicism, but it can also reflect a social environment where alliances are fragile and where betrayal is costly. Betrayal is common in contested political landscapes. If legitimacy is moving, if authority is reforming, people learn caution. Caution makes populations governable under stress. Now we connect these themes to administrative life more directly. When temples and palaces rely on ceilings, custody chains, and restricted deposits, they also need social discipline. They need workers who do not steal from sealed stores. They need scribes who do not leak information. They need officials who obey transfer orders. Wisdom literature can function as the cultural reinforcement of those requirements. It teaches the moral frame that makes compliance feel natural. We also find in some wisdom texts a preoccupation with the proper handling of knowledge. Knowledge is treated as powerful, dangerous, to be pursued, but also to be managed. There are hints that certain knowledge is not for everyone. That instruction should be given at the right time, that the wise should not cast their insight into hostile ears. Again, this can be timeless. But in an investigative reading, it resonates with compartmentalized crisis management. If a retreat was managed by a narrow circle, the habit of restricted knowledge would become part of the culture. Restriction is the mental form of a sealed chamber. Now we bring in the Anunnaki idea as a conceptual layer once more. If the high authority tier is represented in myth as a divine assembly, then controlling discourse about that tier becomes important. You do not want public conversation to dwell on vulnerability at the top. You want the population to keep believing in order. Wisdom texts can help maintain that belief by redirecting attention away from the politics of gods and toward the ethics of individuals. Instead of asking whether the divine order failed, the listener is taught to ask whether they themselves are behaving properly. This is not manipulation in a sinister sense. It is a stabilizing strategy. It keeps the social machine running while the institutional machine repairs itself. We also examine how wisdom texts treat foreignness and change. Some advice warns against unfamiliar practices, against adopting behaviors that weaken tradition, against abandoning established norms. Such warnings often appear in times when the social fabric feels threatened by external influence or internal fragmentation. If authority has been contested by outsiders or rival groups, the cultural response can be to intensify tradition as a defensive wall. Tradition becomes a shelter. At the same time, some wisdom texts counsel adaptability, patience, and strategic humility. They teach people how to bend without breaking. That combination, rigidity in values and flexibility in tactics, is exactly what a society needs during prolonged instability. Now we pause on a small but potent image. A scribe in a dim room copying a proverb onto clay. The proverb does not mention a war. It does not mention a divine defeat. It simply advises restraint, discretion, obedience, careful speech, careful handling of property. But those virtues align with a world where legitimacy objects have been moved, where custody is tight, and where the highest authority tier cannot be publicly described as vulnerable. The investigation pauses with a question that feels almost gentle. If a society learns to praise silence, what was it taught not to say? The last evidence is rarely dramatic. It is usually a box that closes, a shelf label, a clay lump pressed against a cord, a line of wedges that says the same thing a locked door says. Do not enter, not now, not without authority. We step into an imagined storeroom that is both physical and conceptual, the place where an institution gathers what it cannot afford to lose. The room is narrow, the ceiling is low, the air is cooler than the courtyard outside. Mud brick walls hold the day's heat back, and the floor is packed hard by many feet. Along one side are jars with clay stoppers, each stopper impressed with a seal. Along another side are baskets covered with cloth, the cloth tied down with cord, the cord fixed in place by clay ceilings. In the corner are wooden boxes, their edges reinforced, their lids bound. This is not a room designed for use. It is a room designed for continuity. Continuity is what a system prizes when its environment becomes unpredictable. Continuity is the promise that the system can reappear, that the same gods, the same rights, the same offices, the same legitimacy can be reassembled later, even if the city itself cannot hold them now. We pay attention to the kinds of things that get stored in such a room. First are the objects of presence, not the entire temple, not the entire city, but the portable cores that make a sanctuary a sanctuary. implements used in rites, vessels used in offerings, items associated with the identity of a divine seat. In a culture where presence can be mediated through objects, the objects become the carrier of presence. Second are the objects of authority: seals, seal stones, seal ownership lists, signets and their associated records. If seals are portable authority, then protecting them protects the ability to validate movement, to claim property, to command compliance. Third are the objects of memory: tablets that prove rights, obligations, and continuity, lists of holdings, registers of personnel, documents of transfer, tablets that might seem dry to an outsider, but are priceless to an institution in exile. If we are looking for a conflict that does not want to be narrated as defeat, these categories are the most revealing. A victorious system leaves these objects where they belong and continues using them openly. A threatened system concentrates them, seals them, and prepares them to move. Now we consider the final boxes, the metaphorical and literal ones. In some administrative traditions, a sealed packet is used to protect a tablet, a clay envelope around a clay document. The envelope can carry a seal impression, making it a legal object. The inner tablet can only be read if the envelope is broken, and breaking it leaves evidence. That is a technology for preserving truth in a world of dispute. Dispute is the atmosphere in which sealed packets flourish. So we ask, what kind of world produces an increased reliance on sealed custody, on restricted deposit language, on tight witness chains, on continuity clauses, on restoration claims, on laments of institutional silence, on wisdom teachings that praise restraint? A world where the public narrative of unbroken order is under pressure. This is where we gather the evidence into a calm, unresolved conclusion. The administrative records, when read for operational logic, suggest moments when core assets were secured and relocated under authority that was narrowed and carefully documented. The architectural residues at key sites suggest phases where access becomes compartmentalized and storage becomes defensive. The kingless-style continuity work suggests repeated efforts to smooth over relocations and maintain a single spine of legitimacy. The laments preserve the experience of absence and institutional shutdown in a voice permitted to say what a ledger cannot. The wisdom texts cultivate restraint, obedience, and manage speech in a way that fits a society trying to stabilize itself under contested conditions. This constellation does not prove a single battle. It does not prove that the Anunnaki carried spears across the sky, but it does suggest something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling. It suggests that the order represented as divine was treated by its own institutions as vulnerable. It suggests that the highest legitimacy assets were handled with the same caution and chain of custody logic that a threatened administration uses when it anticipates loss of territory, contested authority, and uncertain return. If we read war in this frame, war is not a cinematic event. War is pressure on systems. War is the disruption of predictable provisioning and oversight. War is the condition that makes a temple vault feel more important than a temple courtyard. And if we read lost in this frame, lost does not mean annihilated. Lost means displaced. Lost means forced to withdraw. Lost means authority that cannot hold a seat and must relocate its legitimacy into portable form. Now we look at the phrase we're not supposed to know about in the calm, practical way an archive teaches us to read. The concealment can be structural rather than conspiratorial. Public narratives protect the concept of cosmic order by insisting on divine stability. Administrative records protect actual continuity by managing assets and limiting disclosure. The result is not a single secret, but a layered truth. One layer teaches, one layer functions. The layers can coexist without anyone needing to announce that they are in tension. The tension simply lives in the difference between a victory story and a sealing phrase. We can deepen this with one last procedural question, the kind that matters in audits and in retreats alike. Who authorized the sealing? Not the mythic who, not the dramatic enemy, but the administrative who. Which office held the seal that could close a chamber and make it legally closed? Which supervisor could reduce the witness chain and still have the record stand? Which authority could declare a transfer that looked routine but behaved like relocation under constraint? In many systems, the final authority is not the loudest figure. It is the person who controls the seal, the registry, the right to validate. That kind of authority can survive defeat by becoming mobile. So we picture the last moment in a functioning temple office. A scribe presses wedges into clay. A seal owner rolls a cylinder seal across a wet surface. The impression is clean. The cord is tight. The door is closed. The seal dries. The record is filed. A basket is lifted. A courier waits. The city outside may still look intact. The streets may still carry sound. But the core is already in motion, turned into containers and custody chains. If that is what happened, then the war is not hidden in a forbidden book. It is hidden in plain sight, in the ordinary language of administration. Because administration is where defeat is processed into continuity. The investigation pauses with one final, quiet contradiction that we can hold without forcing it to resolve. A system that never loses does not need to practice withdrawal. A system that practices withdrawal has learned it somewhere. In the quiet after these documents, we can let our breathing slow. We can let the clay harden in our imagination, cool and steady, not as a threat, but as a witness. The archives do not demand belief. They invite attention. They ask us to notice how humans build layers of meaning, a public layer that comforts, and a procedural layer that survives. Tonight, we do not need to decide whether the Anunnaki were beings, offices, or a symbolic court. We only need to recognize the shape of the evidence we have held: seals, deposits, restricted rooms, continuity formulas, careful silences. These are not the tools of triumph. They are the tools of endurance. A lost contest, if it existed in this world, would not necessarily leave a battlefield. It would leave a trail of moved objects, tightened oversight, and records designed to outlast a dangerous season. That is the kind of loss that can be absorbed into myth as judgment, and absorbed into administration as protocol, without anyone ever standing up to announce that anything was wrong. So we let the storeroom door close gently in our mind. We hear the soft press of clay against cord. We feel the cooling air of the sealed chamber. We picture the shelf labels and the baskets, not as ominous, but as careful. Care is what remains when certainty disappears. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, You can set these images down like a tablet placed back into foam, safe, contained, no longer demanding anything from you. The world outside your room can be ordinary again. The lamps can stay low. The air can stay soft. And whatever conflicts once pressed against ancient cities can remain at a distance, reduced to marks in clay and the calm discipline of those who wrote them. End of script. Good night.